Welcome back, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our guests, Tom Kay from Forest and Bird, Scott Wilson from Lincoln Agritech, and his two co-presenters, who he's going to introduce to us when we get to him. Welcome to public who've joined us. Very warm welcome to Ngaio and Shade from Ngāti Kahungunu, who actually it was Ngaio that introduced me to the Lincoln Agritech work. Ngāti Kahungunu have been working on this project since it started about 4 years ago. So thank you and welcome. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see Forest and Bird here and Mare, lovely. There's two presentations, both the Forest and Bird, Tom, and then Lincoln Agritech. They work quite closely together, and they're suggesting that they do both their presentations first, and then we have probably about 40 minutes for conversation and questions. But it's quite good to see both of the presentations before we move into questions. So take your notes as you go, because we're going to have plenty of time for conversations at the end. And I suppose why we're having this today is we talked a little bit about it in the Recovery Committee this morning. There's rapid rebuild work going on and stuff that needs to happen quickly to create safety and get us back to a position where we're feeling comfortable for the meantime with the work that we need to do. But of course there's a really big picture about looking forward into the future about how we're going to be approaching our rivers and their management, our flood protection, how we're going to do that in a way that's going to last us well into the future. So that's why these presentations are here today, and we really acknowledge both Lincoln Agritech and Tom that we know also it's a really difficult time for people, and looking like we're looking to the future and looking at land that suddenly is going to be rivers rather than other things is also difficult. But it's really incumbent upon us as governors to be making sure that we're also taking the long-term view while we're also in the middle of what's really a crisis for people. So Tom has too many things behind his name for me to remember them all. So I'm actually going to let Tom introduce himself, but he's a freshwater advocate for Forest and Bird and is specialising really in these conversations around making rooms for rivers. So warm welcome, Tom, and feel free to blow your trumpet to start with if you'd like to.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me all right? And can you see my screen? I seem to be sharing, but I'm not sure if it's...
Yes, and
okay,
yes. Yeah.
Great. Excellent. Kia ora everyone, I'm Tom. I was meant to be there in person. You probably all can tell how foggy it's been in Napier this morning. My plane could not land and we got turned around, so I'm back here in Wellington. I'm from Forest and Bird. I work as Forest and Bird's freshwater advocate. Freshwater's always been the thing I've been interested in. I studied environmental science and did a Masters of Science in Ecology. I was really interested in freshwater, water quality, river habitat, things like that, all because I grew up as a kayaker. Grew up in Hawke's Bay. You have heard me go on about it. I'm from Napier. I grew up kayaking on the Mohaka River. I still spend a lot of time in Napier. I know you've all heard me say that before. I grew up there. My family still lives there. But I'm not there now. I wish I was. And on 14th of February, when Cyclone Gabriel was kind of unleashing the worst of its impact, I wasn't there either. I was in Wellington, but I was following what was happening relatively closely, or at least trying to, as best I could. And in particular, I was following the Tutaikuri River flow gauge, the Puketapu gauge to be exact, because that is upstream of the houses that my parents and my sister and niece and nephew and my brother-in-law live in. They live about 600 metres from the stop bank, or within 600 metres, both of them in two different houses. One of them the house I grew up in. And on that morning of the 14th of February, I was refreshing the gauge on that Puketapu, the website on the Regional Council website, because I was trying to figure out if that gauge was still going up or not. And, you'll all know that was a fruitless exercise. The gauge cut off at about 3 a.m. when the river was flowing at about 1,800 cumecs, probably higher at some point. Some of the water by then was possibly spilling out elsewhere. I was, couldn't tell whether the river was going up or down. By 8 a.m., as you know, the river had burst its banks, probably upstream at Dartmoor, but down here at or near Waiheke, it took out the substation, cutting off power to most of Napier, and then by 10 o'clock it was over the banks around the suburbs of Waiheke first and Taurau after that, spilling out over the streets. Those residents being told to evacuate, my family in those streets being told to evacuate. This on the left being my sister's street in Taurau, where the river had come through the back of EIT, then into her street. On the right there and in the middle, that was sort of the street next to hers, the pathway to my parents' house, which was filled up with water as well. My family was really lucky. They had this flooding that the water came over the banks, but they were okay. They evacuated. They got to my parents' place. It was dry there. They left. They were allowed back the same day. They had 6.5 days without power with a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. They were a bit shaken, but otherwise they were fine. And I'm really aware that that's not the case for other people in the community. That's not the case for some of you. I know that, and you've been heavily impacted, as have a lot of people in the community. But that was my immediate focus during the event, and weirdly, we were getting sort of information quicker than other parts of the region. It became apparent to me and my brother in Wellington and Auckland that the bridge had washed out before my family knew that had happened. Further upstream, of course, at Dartmoor, the river had overtopped the banks there, spread into the valley, and across the region, the aerial imagery that you've taken from before the cyclone and after the cyclone is really telling and really useful to see just the scale of damage and impact and where those rivers went. As well as being useful to show that, it's also really useful to look at the stop bank network, and I know you'll all be really familiar with this image, this being basically that same imagery with Hawke's Bay Regional Council's overlay of stop banks on it, the repairs, the maintenance that's been going on. And it kind of, to me, shows the benefits of that system, the successes of the stop bank network. Taurau was largely protected by the stop bank that had just been raised and strengthened, but it also shows the real limitations of this approach of building walls to keep flood waters out of communities. Taurau still flooded. The stop bank, despite being raised and strengthened, was still overtopped. Waiheke was flooded upstream. Dartmoor was flooded, In some places where that stop bank stayed intact, like Pakowhai, it became essentially a bathtub, that area sort of filling up until it was 5.5 metres deep, and it could actually naturally drain back over the stop bank into the river where the water had been originally. Other places you can see the impact of floodwaters when they burst out through those stop banks, or over the top of, and then cut down through. You can just see that energy from those floodwaters then being sort of spread out across the floodplains and the impact of those systems when they fail. Other places where the stop banks held, this is next to Taurau, the Redcliffe Bridge there on the left, this being the spot where water sort of came over the top of the stop bank just upstream of the bridge. Even where that stop bank stayed intact, that was being eaten away at below the water, threatening the integrity of that stop bank, taking away all that edge protection planting. Other places, lakes were created where they weren't before, or at least, as I'm told by Ngaia, where they weren't since pre-European times at least. Supposedly places like this were originally wetland and lakes and hillsides, wherever vegetation was exposed, or no vegetation, there was just massive soil loss into those catchments. Yeah. Well, it was probably this record-breaking, most intense event we've seen, or at least recorded in Hawke's Bay. It's not the only one. Auckland, just 2 weeks before, had unprecedented flooding. Nelson last year, only a couple of months ago, had unprecedented flooding. Places like Gisborne, Tairāwhiti are hit all the time by rivers flooding, taking out infrastructure. Westport, 2021, it was Hakatari River, Ashburton Way. Canterbury was hit before that in 2019 with the Rangitata River overtopping its banks or taking out flood protection infrastructure. And Edgecombe in 2017, classic kind of stop bank failure, waters filling a community. After the event, Dr. Sam Dean, this is after Cyclone Gabriel, Dr. Sam Dean from NIWA said, "I have no doubt in my mind that climate change has influenced that event." And Met Service, after it, said these events will become more severe as the planet continues to warm. That means heavier rain, more problems from flooding. I'm sure you know that. You might have seen in the news over the past couple of days how we've just had our warmest June on record in the world, passing that 1.5 degree threshold. Antarctic sea ice at an all-time low. But it's not just climate change. We talk a lot about climate change and the impact of climate change exacerbating these events, but it's also the way we've managed the environment, and that's why we've seen these events in the past as well, and the way we interact with and live in the environment. Things like wetland clearance across the country. On the left here, predicted historic wetland extent across Aotearoa. On the right, the current wetland extent. We've drained or got rid of 90% of the wetlands across Aotearoa, Hawke's Bay, obviously, being one of those regions where that's happened significantly. Likewise with forests. On the left here, before human settlement, forest cover of Aotearoa. On the right, the current forest cover. Again, Hawke's Bay being one of those areas that's pretty stark, where we've taken away forest from the hillsides, its ability to hold rainfall in the canopy, absorb rain, slow rain down, and where we've kept those forests, we've introduced pests, deer, goats, pigs, possums. Here is an image of the Kāweka Forest Park. On the left, you've got an area that is accessible to deer and pests. It's hunted. It's the most heavily hunted part of the Kāwekas on the left there, but it just still does not compare to the image on the right, which is a fenced part of the Kāweka Forest Park, where that undergrowth is able to grow and regenerate naturally. So those pests have just massively impacted the ability of those forests to hold and absorb water in their canopies and slow water down. So it's climate change, but it's wetland loss, it's forest loss, and it's how we've managed our rivers, how we've interacted with our rivers, how we've constrained them through time. Back in the 40s, this is obviously an image of its time. Things have changed. We've cleared forest, whatever. But rivers used to have relative freedom to move across floodplains, to erode, to work out what kind of space they needed to be in equilibrium with the catchment conditions at the time. You can draw lines around the rough sort of area that river's operating in and compare it to how we've managed those rivers now and the space that we've taken away from them. When we put stop banks in, we didn't leave those rivers with a lot of space to continue working in that equilibrium. We constrained them significantly to try and take that land. This is the Tukituki River, obviously up by State Highway 50. You can do this all the way down the Tukituki River as you get closer to the townships there in central Hawke's Bay. This being Waipukuro, Tukituki River flowing past there in the 1940s compared to now. Significant constraint of those rivers. You can do it all across the country. I've picked these rivers here. I've shown some of you these before. This is the Ngaruroro River, a huge, open, wide braided river, hundreds of metres wide. In the 50s, this is 1950, compared that to now, still hundreds of metres wide, still amazing bird habitat and things like that, but hundreds of metres less wide than it used to be. If people are interested in that, I've actually uploaded that imagery to the Coordinates website. Hawke's Bay Regional Council doesn't have that imagery online like some other councils do. I understand you're working on it, but in the meantime, it's up there if people want to see it. We've done this at all sorts of scales as well. Hawke's Bay is not the only place. Canterbury Plains people would be aware of, but also small rivers, right? Small streams, concreted them, taken away that diversity, taken away the space those rivers had. There's a whole heap of unintended consequences to this, and one of those consequences we talked about by Joe and Scott and Richard, but I'm going to go through a sort of series of them. One, this is the Tukituki River, so it's relevant to you guys. One is that when we take these rivers with this big open gravel space and we constrain them with stop banks and we kind of take away the space that they had, we end up with this situation where these rivers kind of used to be able to move across their floodplains and spread gravel out. They're bringing gravel and sediment down from the hills. We're a relatively young country, uplifting, erosion prone, and we build these floodplains like Hawke's Bay and the Canterbury Plains out of those materials. We put stop banks in, like you can see at the bottom here, this cross-section of the Tukituki River, and then that river's constrained in the space that it can deposit that gravel, and it basically starts to fill that area up until you end up with this river that's kind of perched up above its floodplain, and you have a river that's potentially higher than the communities that are living next to it. Similarly, cutting into that gravel area that those rivers have massively influenced, or seems to influence, and Joe and Co will be able to speak to this more than me, seems to influence how those rivers recharge and interact with the groundwater beneath them. So you take a big wide braided river that's interacting with the groundwater, you cut the area that it had in half, and you essentially cut down the ability of that river to recharge its groundwater. We have a lot of conversations in Hawke's Bay around water security, water storage, managed aquifer recharge even. Turns out the way we've managed our rivers has probably actually stopped them recharging themselves, and now we're trying to re-engineer that in different ways. And there's work being undertaken in the Ngaruroro, which I'll let Joe and Richard and Scott speak to. There's also an enormous effort that goes into managing rivers this way, right? This is the Manawatu Awa in Palmerston North. This is a corner where the river runs down into this bank that's been lined with rocks to protect a subdivision at the top of that hill. A lot of effort goes into getting those rocks, putting them there, lining that section of river to protect this area. And then what you find is the river, because it can't erode that corner anymore, basically takes that energy and looks for somewhere else to erode further downstream. And you see that in the river, where you then have another section of the river lined with rocks, which is more effort, more expense, finding more rock to do that. Basically, as far as you want to keep constraining that river all the way downstream, because it just continues to bounce, and you fight that. An approach which even Horizons has acknowledged as unsustainable just a couple of weeks ago. One of the impacts I've looked at the most, or I'm most familiar with, is the impact on habitat, right? These big open braided rivers had habitat for inanga, whitebait, tuna, eels, birds being a big thing in Hawke's Bay's braided rivers. When we constrain those rivers, or we straighten them, or we line them with rocks, we take away that habitat. That's the places that all these fish and birds and insects live and breed and feed. It's also things like, the riffles, the runs, and the pools. The pools are the swimming holes that communities go and swim in. It's all that stuff that we're taking away, the riparian vegetation, all that important part of the ecosystem is gone. And you see that with different streams. Again, a Palmerston North example, this is the Mangone stream, basically had all its sort of riparian vegetation stripped away. It's been locked into place with stop banks and this little meander pattern. It's actually completely straightened further downstream. And not only do you destroy the habitat in that area, you also end up with one of the key things that I think you need to really be considering is the false sense of security that you get with these systems. So this is a stop banked stream in Palmerston North. These stop banks are basically at the height of people's roofs, yet we've allowed development to come right in next to those stop banks and next to that stream. So you essentially end up with this situation where you have this river that's been locked into place. In some places that river has been lined with bits of concrete or stone. You have big high stop banks that are quite close to it as well. And then when that river floods and fills up with water, you end up with tons of water, literally tons, because every cubic metre of water weighs a ton, tons of water up above the floodplain, perched behind these stop banks. And if those stop banks fail or are overtopped, as you all know now, there's an enormous amount of energy behind that water when it sort of descends back down into the floodplain from being up above it. And you've got examples of this in Hawke's Bay. That's Taradale there with the stop bank, obviously at the bottom of the image, and development up to that river. So there's all these impacts, but there's also a cost to that. There's the cost of maintenance of sort of fighting the river into place, like I talked about, but there's also the cost of failure of that infrastructure or failure of that system. And you're discussing that now, but Treasury has put the cost of the damage from the Auckland and Hawke's Bay floods at between $9 billion and $14.5 billion. And that's the impact that's kind of being talked about the most at the national level now, unfortunately. But there's also the human cost to this, right? And cost is a horrible word to put on it, but it's everything from, people seeing their houses or properties be flooded, like my friend here who was rescuing a chicken from the floodwaters in this photo. But right through to mental health, ongoing months of uncertainty, sort of the fear of living behind a stop bank, right through to loss of life. Some river experts, including some of the people in the room, who you'll be able to quiz later, hopefully, on this, last year wrote a paper titled Reanimating the Strangled Rivers of Aotearoa, New Zealand. They were looking at river management in New Zealand and across the world, basically, and how sort of problematic that approach actually is. They concluded things, or said things like, working against nature does not work. We may inadvertently be manufacturing future disasters, and moving out of harm's way saves lives, written at the end of last year. It was really similar actually to some stuff we pulled out from an inquiry into flood mitigation measures following Cyclone Bowler that was written in 1988 by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment at the time. who after that extreme weather event said things like extensive deforestation has led to greatly accelerated widespread severe erosion, draining of wetlands has intensified flooding problems in many areas as wetlands can buffer flood flows, and unwise intensive development behind stop banks has often been encouraged. All things that I recognise you're starting to note in your recovery plan for the region. Last year, Forest and Bird launched this campaign, Making Room for Rivers, Tukuana Awa Kia Riri. Coincidentally, you might recognise the rivers in that photo, right? It's the Waitangi Estuary. Who would have thought that that was going to be the next place to flood, basically, after us putting it on the cover of this. But we launched this to kind of coincide with this expert movement in New Zealand to recognise that the traditional approach to river management hasn't worked. There was a conference held last year on making room for rivers, and experts were kind of acknowledging this, and we thought, how can we contribute to this conversation? How can we maybe bring the public along to understand the issues or the opportunities in this? We were calling for a national Making Room for Rivers plan, for money for flood protection from central government, because we recognise how difficult that is for you as councils, and for a group of experts to be put together to actually help councils with guidance on this kind of thing. Basically, the concept comes from overseas, if you want to sort of give it claim, or where it became famous in the Netherlands, taking this idea that having stop banks lining rivers really tightly and lining rivers with concrete or whatever it is really problematic for all those reasons I listed. And having more space between stop banks, or even moving out of some floodplains entirely, provides much more space for a river to naturally adjust within its floodplain. It provides space for riparian areas and habitat, for people to walk and interact with the river. It makes river access easier. You can have stop banks that are lower because they're further set back, so you can hold the same amount of floodwaters in smaller stop banks. And the loading on those stop banks is much lower because that water isn't as high up above the floodplain. It hasn't got as much energy behind it, and waters are flowing slower. It also means that if that stop bank system is ever overtopped, the energy behind that water is less. Excuse me. And, in places where you actually move people out of a floodplain, you haven't got that risk to those people. It's an idea, as I said, that came out of the Netherlands. They basically recognised that building stop banks bigger and bigger wasn't going to be sustainable for them. And this is a place where they talk in annual exceedance probabilities of, 1 in 1,000, where we're talking in sort of 1 in 100 in New Zealand. And it's been picked up all around the world. This is the River Isar in Munich, an example that I really like, that shows an urban river where this has been done. Some of those same experts summarised some of the stuff from overseas in another article that was written, a conversation piece that said, international studies show that allowing a river to self-adjust is cheaper and more effective than active interventions that force a river in a particular place. And it's not just an international thing now. It's being picked up in New Zealand already, and I know that some of you are aware of some of this stuff, and I've talked to you about some of it before. Greater Wellington Regional Council, for example, has recognised this pinch point on Te Awa Kairangi, the Hutt River and Lower Hutt, and they've just acquired all these properties, residential and commercial, to actually turn this back into green space starting this year. They're widening the river by 90 metres. They're raising the height of the stop bank as well, but they're also creating more space for the river. They've recognised this concept of making room for rivers in their Aparua Mahanga flood management plan, and they've also just written this document, which you've all got now, how Greater Wellington can work towards allowing more room for the region's rivers. They've even gone so far as just at the end of last year to propose changing their regional policy statement, which had prioritised, in considering hazard mitigation measures, the need for structural protection works or hard engineering methods. They're proposing to strike through that and replace it with a recognition or a nod towards whether green infrastructure, room for the river, or mātauranga Māori options are maybe more appropriate. Not, saying that they're not going to engineer anything, but prioritising this as the sort of best practice recognised approach as being the first thing that should be looked at. Other councils are doing similar stuff. Horizon's got money from Kanoa, the Regional Economic Development Fund, to change the way they manage a section of the Rangitike River, this being a section down closer to the coast, looking at allowing that river a mobility corridor. They're quite lucky here. I think the stop bank's already set back a bit from the river, but they were still jumping in with willows and sort of edge works to keep that river in place. They are going to back off that approach, remove the exotics, try and replant in natives, and let this river kind of adjust within that space. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Mayor of Auckland put out this plan, Making Space for Water, which included 9 actions, including, this sort of nature-based solutions idea of green infrastructure, as well as things like, increased maintenance of stormwater networks and things. And this is being given increased importance through the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. There's an opportunity here in that it aligns really well with some policies in that NPS. Things like the loss of river extended values are avoided to the extent practical, and habitats of Indigenous freshwater species are protected. And in the National Adaptation Plan, which has an action to prioritise nature-based solutions. So there's an enormous, opportunity here for councils, and particularly Hawke's Bay Regional Council, in looking how it recovers from Cyclone Gabrielle to do something really different and leverage off all these opportunities. And it's really exciting to actually be here in the room talking to you about this kind of stuff. I'm going to go through a quick list, just summarising some of the things that Wellington recognise in their document about how councils could consider making more room for rivers, but obviously they're all sort of context specific, and you've got different priorities with recovering from the cyclone. Things like data collection and flood hazard modelling are really important. LiDAR stuff, you've got great LiDAR in the region, and I saw that you want to do another LiDAR assessment, which would be awesome. But then communicating that to the public is really important, so they understand where rivers used to be in the landscape, where they're going to go potentially in future, where water's going to go when these places flood. Things like planning measures, I think there's enormous opportunity for. I appreciate you've got some frustrations with how fast you can move those processes, and you're looking at sort of delaying some of the NPS stuff. But I also really want to stress that some of the impacts that you've seen in the region are a result of lacking some of those strong policy protections for rivers and freshwater in the past. So I think there's enormous opportunity in things like regional policy statement and plans going forward, how you zone rivers, how you look at development and restricting development in future, which is something they've done in the Netherlands and overseas in Australia and things, but also calling on central government if you need an NPS on this kind of thing, and using tools like bylaws and things. Reframing your river management plans like Wellington has done to talk about room for rivers and prioritising that. Doing climate hazard risk assessments, which I know you're doing, which is great. Thinking about these kind of things, and also thinking about your management of land reserves and parks. Auckland led to a huge conversation about sponge cities, and I know that that's mentioned in your regional recovery plan as well, looking at wetland restoration on public land. And Forest and Bird, if you jump on our website, also has that mapping website, also has some maps of historic wetland that is still in public ownership, which you might be interested in. Likewise, you've got annual planning, long-term planning, infrastructure plans. I know these are really problematic, but the key thing to think about with this is that we need to get away from just thinking about a one-year economic benefit kind of thing and start thinking long-term. Greater Wellington Regional Council calculated that if that river flooded at the point in Lower Hutt, it would do $1 billion worth of damage, and that is how they justified buying all those properties, because the cost of buying those properties was less than the cost of a flood event. Community conservation initiatives are really important for this kind of thing. The work that the likes of Forest and Bird are doing upstream in catchments is critical to reducing impacts downstream. Things like the old legislation that you've got powers under, the Soil Conservation and River Control Act. Councils do have a lot of power to acquire land or manage rivers in a way that could make room for rivers. It doesn't have to be used for traditional old school approaches of building stop banks or whatever. Being really smart with your future development, which I'm sure you're super conscious of now that you don't want to put anyone else in harm's way going forward. And unfortunately, you haven't got the luxury of necessarily thinking immediately so much about managed retreat, but actually using this as an event to think really long term about, hey, managed retreat can be staged over time. Again, that Wellington example, Greater Wellington Regional Council didn't just come in and buy those properties and tell people to leave. It was a very sort of gradual process, and they came in and actually said, hey, look, you've got options. Do you want to stay? We're not going to start this project for 5 years. I'll finish so I don't take too much time with this image and a couple of quotes. This image from the Rangitata River. In 1937, it had a north and south branch. That island in the middle there was called Rangitata Island. It's not there anymore, basically, that, or at least it's not an island. It's still called Rangitata Island, but that south branch is gone. When the river flooded in 2019, it went right back to where it had been in the past. It was still a flood zone in the regional plan, but farm infrastructure had been put there, centre pivot irrigators, fences, all sorts of stuff. To me, this really shows, and I know you've experienced it directly, that the rivers at some point will take back the space that they had before. And if we can preempt that and be really careful about where we plan, then that's something that I really think is worth doing. That Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment report that I quoted said in 1988 that a possible effect of climate change is that cyclones of some form could pass close to New Zealand with increasing frequency. It may be that in retrospect the Bowler storm will not be regarded as such an extreme event. And in the interests of future generations, government cannot allow the nation's floodplain land to be unwisely used. Hawke's Bay has been struck by disaster before. I learned as a kid, and I'm sure you all did, about the earthquake. It was drilled into our heads every year. After that, the council said, look, stone is problematic, wood is problematic because of fires, and they looked at ferrocrete and reinforced concrete and said, right, we're going to rebuild in reinforced concrete because that's the modern way. And I think Hawke's Bay Regional Council has an opportunity here to go, what has been the problem with how we've managed our environment and managed our rivers, and how can we leverage off that to rebuild in a really modern, best practice way and kind of be the, take that Art Deco inspiration and be the natural leader in this environment. I've given you 3 things to read. They're almost 3 levels of detail. Forest and Birds Making Room for Rivers thing, an example from Greater Wellington Regional Council, and then this paper. You've got some authors in the room. You can quiz about this afterwards. But yeah, I will leave it at that, and I will pass on to them so that they have a decent amount of time as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. You can even watch it for a second time, and it's still interesting. So it must be good. I think it's my 3rd time. Great. Welcome, Scott and Joe and Richard. If you can introduce the team as well, and we'll go straight into your presentation.
Right. So I'm going to kick off. So I'm Jo Hoyle, work for NIWA. Are they working?
They're fine. Yeah, just push them into the middle and play so all 3 of you can use it.
Excellent. Can everyone hear me? So I'm Jo Hoyle and I work for NIWA. This is Scott Wilson, who works for Lincoln Agritech, and Richard Measures, who works for NIWA as well. And we're going to give a bit of a tag team talk today. And we're talking about an MB-funded research program that's all focused on understanding groundwater recharge from braided rivers. But before we kick off, I guess we want to provide a little bit of context of why a flood response group of people should be interested in groundwater recharge. It might seem like a pretty strange fit, but hopefully that will become clear as we go through. And I really just want to acknowledge that it's not just us working on this project. There's a lot of collaborators working in this research. So I won't name them all, but the logos are up there. And one of the spaces that we're working in is in the Hawke's Bay. So I guess firstly, the motivation for this research is that braided rivers are really important sources of groundwater recharge, and that source of groundwater is really important for supporting our agricultural and horticultural industries. But one of the problems that we have is that we're seeing long-term declines in regional aquifer levels in many regions, and this is an example from the Heretaunga Plains. And we know that this decline is not just climate-driven, and it's not just fully explained by water abstraction. So this kind of piqued our interest. This is a real concern with increasing extreme weather events. So in your mind, you're thinking about floods perhaps, but we also need to be really conscious of droughts. So we've just had 3 back-to-back La Nina years, which has meant warm, wet weather, but we are currently undergoing a really rapid flip back into an El Nino year, which means dry weather on the east coast. So we need to be thinking about extreme weather in terms of floods and droughts. Even though we know that braided rivers are really important sources of groundwater recharge, we're typically not thinking about how what's going on the surface of rivers might be relating to groundwater recharge. And historically, our river management, as Tom's explained, has been largely flood focused. That's meant trying to protect the margins of our rivers from erosion by planting willows, building stop banks to try and hold that floodwater in, trying to manage bed levels by extracting gravel. And rivers are, a great ready source of gravel. But an unfortunate consequence of that has been narrowing of our rivers, and it's particularly clear in braided rivers. So this is an example from the Ngāruroro, showing the river in 1964 and 2018, I think. And I guess as a bit of a spoiler alert, that reduction in groundwater recharge has happened over the same period that we've seen this narrowing in our rivers. So the river management focus on floods is not surprising. Floods can do a lot of damage, as you're well aware of, particularly when the flood defences fail. And this just shows some examples of some of the costs of extreme weather. The numbers I've got there for the Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle are a bit different to what Tom had, so maybe take the numbers with a bit of a grain of salt. But I guess the point is we have to manage for floods, and with climate change we are going to get more and more extreme floods. So we're not saying don't manage for floods. But what if the way that we've been managing rivers for floods is actually impacting our drought resilience as well? Droughts also come with a big cost. You can see there the cost of the North Island drought and the Auckland water crisis back in 2020. It wasn't that long ago. So I guess what we're thinking is how can we manage rivers better to protect for floods and droughts and other values? And I guess that's what we want you to be conscious of when you're thinking about response to Cyclone Gabrielle, is actually not being fixated on floods, but actually thinking big picture. So that's enough from me.
So I'm Scott Wilson. I'm based at Lincoln University. I'm a hydrogeologist. I'm not a river expert. So I get a lot of my river knowledge from these guys. And what we did was we realised that we didn't really know a lot about how rivers interact with our aquifer systems in New Zealand. And so we set up this research program to understand this a little bit better. And there's essentially three research questions that we posed. The first is, how do these rivers actually work beneath the surface? What's going on down there? They look really complex. Is there a way that we can actually simplify that complexity so that we can even represent them in a catchment scale model? The second question is one of quantification. Once we know how they work, can we actually quantify how much water goes where? How much stays in the river, how much goes to groundwater recharge? How much management of the river influences the water balance? That's the third question. So that's the so what question. So once we understand them, we can quantify them. What happens if we start playing around with some of the parameters? What's the influence of channel shape and elevation on the water balance? So to do this, investigate this, we chose 3 rivers throughout the country: the Ngātaroto here, the Wairoa in Marlborough, and the Selwyn Waikatikere locally in Canterbury. And the rivers are all quite different. They all have quite different characteristics. I guess one of the key things to note is that the Wairoa is really tightly constrained. It's a river with a huge amount of energy. It's been really probably over-narrowed through flood engineering, quite heavily narrowed. The other one thing to note is the Selwyn Waikatikere. It's actually a foothills-fed river, so it doesn't have the same kind of frequency of flood flows as the Ngātaroto and the Wairoa have. You can see that the vegetation's been allowed to sort of build up in the break plain there, but they all have their own unique characteristics. But they're all quite different. So looking at the Ngātaroto, we're essentially studying the main recharge reach between Roy's Hill and Fern Hill, and this has been said to provide something like 80% of the, or 70-80% of the recharge to the Eratoa Plain, something like that. Certainly, we think the recharge rate from the Stretcher River is somewhere on the order of 3.5 to 4 cubic, but it's variable. So what happens is the river is heading downstream from the bottom left, and once it leaves the hills, it starts to leak water out onto the gravels on the right there. You can see the arrows showing the direction of flow out towards the Heretaunga Plain. And we're losing about 2 to 2.5 cubic of water through there. And then it starts to lose a little bit less further downstream to the east, and a little bit more, maybe about a cubic beneath Amahu. What I've also drawn on there is that red line is the extent of the river from the
64.
Is it 64? Yeah, 64 aerial photo. And the little light blue square at the bottom is the artificial aquifer recharge scheme that was operated between 1988 and 2008. And I'm just going to show you a groundwater level from a well, which is on the right-hand side of the page there. Over here, towards Hastings a little bit. It's the substation well. And you can see that in this well there's a really long-term decline. This well's great because it started monitoring back in 1969. So we've got a really long-term record there. But you can see that there's a really steady long-term decline there. Certainly the peaks and troughs increase in magnitude, but there is this long-term decline. And one of the things I will point out is the blue shaded area there. That's when the artificial recharge scheme was in operation. And one of the things that happened is it actually did stabilise groundwater levels to some degree. It became less efficient over time, and so it became less efficient at stabilising groundwater levels. But then once that was switched off, groundwater levels started declining again. Interestingly, that recharge scheme was put in response to the 1981-82 drought, which is interesting because it's not long after the river engineering was undertaken, and you have to question, well, were those groundwater level declines that they were seeing because of the drought, or were they because of the river engineering? I'll just leave you that one to ponder. So what we've done is we've put in a monitoring network in this area. So I've shown all of our little piezo's in red there. And we've done lots of other bits and pieces like river morphology work and flow gauging losses and so forth. But we're very much focused on that river groundwater interaction process there, that specific reach. And one of the things we've done is we've used sonic coring, which is a fairly new drilling method, and it enables us to actually collect core, which we can see, so we're not losing all of the fine sediments when we core through the sediment. And what I've done here is I've highlighted in blue and red two different types of sediment that you can see beneath each of the rivers that we've studied. The sections highlighted in blue are really loose gravels, quite well sorted. So they're unconsolidated. And beneath those, in each river, you see a more consolidated, poorly sorted gravel. And that contact can be found beneath each of the three rivers, and it can also be found at the same depth within each river. But it differs between each river. And what we now know is happening here is that the river is essentially creating its own little aquifer system, which is that loose, unconsolidated material that you can see highlighted in blue. So beneath the Ngātaroro, that's actually quite a thin layer. It's only about 1.5 metres thick. And so what's happening is you get a flood flow, and the river mobilises all of those gravels, and it winnows out the fine material, and it leaves this nice, loose, clean lag deposit behind, which sits on top of these more consolidated, slightly less permeable materials underneath. So you can imagine this very thin gravel, which is essentially a part of the river. If you dig a hole anywhere across the active grade plane, you'll find water. And that's water that's sitting within those gravels, those loose, unconsolidated gravels. So they're really important. And provisionally we're calling this a braid plane aquifer, for want of a better term. So if we look at a cross-section or a long section down the Ngātaroro River from our study reach, we've drilled some core within the riverbed from Roy's Hill for a distance about 2 kilometres downstream. And so this is a profile, like if you took a slice down the river, this is a little bit what it would look like. The bit that's in blue or sort of green is the river's surface taken from the LiDAR measurement, and plotted the river surface slightly just underneath that in blue, light blue. And you can see that the water table on those braid grain gravels is actually emerging with that LiDAR. So what's happening is the river is interacting with that water table. And the water table is being exposed at the surface as the river in topographic low points. A little bit deeper down, I've plotted the water table in the regional aquifer in dark blue. And in between those two water surfaces, you can see that there's a dashed black line and a dashed brown line. And those are the base of those braid plane aquifer gravels. That's the base of those loose, well-sorted gravels. So the gravels underneath that surface are those more low permeability material gravels. And what's really interesting is that we can actually see that the depth of that contact between those two types of gravels, as we see in the core, roughly corresponds to the depth of the pools that you see in the riverbed. So what's happening is you get a flood flow, you get scouring, and that scouring where you see a deep pool is the depth to which the river has mobilised all the gravels. So the two roughly correspond. Now what's really interesting about this Ngātaroru cross-section is that in the upstream part, which is on the left of the page, the regional water table sits beneath that contact. And what that means is that there's actually an unsaturated zone between the base of those unconsolidated gravels and the regional water table. And then as you move downriver, you'll see that the water table starts to go into those loose braid pan gravels on the right-hand side here. Is it that one?
Yeah.
Nah, it's not actually working that well.
Maybe use that.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Yeah, you can see in here that this water table here is starting to enter the braid plain aquifer, and eventually the two water tables will merge as you go downstream. So I want to try and illustrate this conceptually, what's going on. This is the situation in the upstream part of the river. You've got this nice braid plain aquifer here of these nice clean gravels, and then there's a lower permeability horizon. So we've got a change from unconsolidated to poorly sorted consolidated sediments in here. And then we've got a regional aquifer which is sitting underneath, and the river is leaking vertically down to it. To press that one, too many controls. Now, if you walk across that river, what you can see is that the interaction between the river and the braid plain aquifer is actually changing in different places in the river. So there's bits of river which are sitting above the braid plain aquifer water level and leaking down. You can get bits where the river's sitting within the braid plain aquifer and recharging it, or we can get bits of the river where it's sitting within the braid plain aquifer and gaining water from it. So sometimes you can see little seeps in the riverbed. But if you sort of step out a little bit and look at that braid plain aquifer system as a whole, as part of the river, you could actually notice that you see actually a hydraulic connection between the whole river system and the regional aquifer. So in this case, the two are not hydraulically connected. There's an unsaturated zone between the two, and water is recharged by percolating down through those sediments beneath the braid plain and into the regional aquifer. If you look downstream, you can see the same kind of processes happening within the river, different kinds of connection between the river channels and the braid plain aquifer itself. But as a whole, the system is hydraulically connected, so the water table in the regional aquifer enters that braid plain aquifer and then exits out the other side. This is actually quite a complex scenario because instead of the water percolating vertically downwards, the relationship between the flow between the river and the regional aquifer is actually controlled by the head gradient between the two. So if you raise the water level in the braid plain aquifer, it'll increase the amount of recharge to the regional aquifer. So to summarise, what we've discovered is that really the river system is much larger than what you see on the surface. It's a little bit like an iceberg. You see the surface expression, but it's maintained by this storage which is within those gravels in that braid plain aquifer system. And that gravel reservoir is created by the river's functioning as a flooding system. So it's basically creating its own aquifer system through bed mobility. And this braid plain aquifer provides water storage, and it mediates the exchange between the river and the regional aquifer, and it also attenuates temperature. But one key thing to think about is that you don't get direct recharge from the river to the regional aquifer. It goes through that reservoir first, so that's mediating the exchange of water. And that's important because the effectiveness of that braid plain aquifer to function as a mediator depends on its integrity. And that integrity is influenced by river management, and Rich will talk about that a little bit more. But we see that there are opportunities to increase groundwater recharge by considering rivers as one component of a wider water and gravel balance. So it's kind of a holistic view, and they can be managed with that subsurface process in mind, which is integrated management. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Pass on to Richard.
So I guess Scott's given you a bit of a insight into the sort of science that we've been doing there, and I guess I'm going to talk about now sort of what does that mean for river management, and then kind of get into what we're doing now in the project, which is doing some scenarios to look at changed management. So if we first take a backwards look, and you're familiar with all these pictures now, you've seen them numerous times. So this is our study reach in 1964. It was a lot wider, but now if we use that scientific understanding to look at this, what does that mean in terms of this conceptual model of the Braid Plain Aquifer? So if this was our river in 1964, and we've made it narrower, we've basically reduced the area of the planform area of the Braid Plain Aquifer, and in the upstream part of the reach, where it's got that sort of unsaturated zone, it's leaking vertically downwards from the Braid Plain Aquifer to the regional aquifer. We've just got less area for that leakage to occur over, so the recharge rate is reduced. And just as a bit of an example, so this is just a zoom in on that upstream part of our study reach. We've done some flow gaugings, and as Scott said, there's about 2 cubics of groundwater recharge, so 2 tons a second going into the regional aquifer from the river over this reach. If we made the river 100 metres wider, that's about 600 litres a second extra recharge. It's just the ratio of the areas. And if we just, for sort of comparison, we compare that to that artificial aquifer recharge, that was around, I think, at its peak, around 400 litres a second. And it kind of just comes down to the area. It's a lot of effort to get water through the stop bank and out into this artificial area. The same work could be done by the river if it was a little bit wider. The other thing that's happened historically is, as well as changing the width of the rivers, the bed levels are changing. And what we're looking at here is kind of a graph showing the lower part of the Narrororo River, and the axis of the graph is the natural deposition rate if there was no gravel extraction. So the river's like a conveyor belt transporting gravel from the hills down to the sea or down to the lower river. But the lower part of the Narrororo River, the gradient reduces, it flattens out. So the river has less energy to transport the gravel. And what that means is it deposits gravel on the bed, and naturally the bed's coming up. And our study reaches the sort of between Orhiti and Fern Hill there. So kind of close to that sort of peak of that gravel deposition. And what that means from a flood engineering response is some gravel extraction is required, otherwise the bed is going to go up and up and up and up, and the flood levels will go up and up and up, and you get this flood risks. But it's this balance of how much gravel you take versus this natural deposition rate, which averages maybe 20-30 millimetres a year, I think, on that graph. And that's what controls the long-term trend in bed levels. If deposition exceeds extraction, you get build up of bed levels. If extraction exceeds deposition, then the bed levels drop. But what we've seen in that reach of the Narrororo, that key recharge reach, is because it's a relatively short haulage distance, the gravel's really valuable, and there's been so much taken from that reach that historically the bed levels have dropped by around 2 metres. And if we go back to Scott's conceptual model, in the lower part of the river there, where it's connected to the regional aquifer, if we drop the riverbed, we reduce the volume of the Braid Plain Aquifer, so there's less storage in the riverbed gravels, and we reduce the driving head, the energy available to pump water from the river into the regional aquifer. So again, we're reducing recharge by reducing the bed level. So that's kind of a backwards look, and then looking forwards, so that the part of the project we're working on now is this kind of scenario assessment. So we had a workshop here in Hawke's Bay Regional Council with a bunch of different people. We had another one in Blenheim with the Wairo, and we came up with some scenarios to explore kind of what could the river look like if we did things a bit differently. And we're looking at sort of 2 different types of scenarios. One was changing bed levels, so changing gravel extraction, and the other one was changing the river width. And just as a example of one of those scenarios, so this is the current river, just sort of simplified. So the grey is like the active braid plain, the green is sort of this vegetation buffer, your willows and plantings, and then the yellow lines are the stop banks. And one of the scenarios we're looking at, we've termed a sort of moderate widening scenario. So here the stop banks haven't moved much. There's one short length, I think, of stop bank in here. We realigned in our hypothetical imaginary world just because that was a pinch point and we thought that was important. But mostly the stop banks are in the same place. We're working kind of within the existing regional council managed land largely. But we've made a lot more space for the river. And we've got other scenarios where we change gravel extraction and the bed level goes up and down and so on. And the stage we're focusing on now is really sort of modelling what these changes mean for the recharge, and then also working through kind of with economists, what does this mean for a whole bunch of different values? So just on the right there, you've got kind of all the things we came up with that are affected by these, or potentially affected by these changes in scenarios. So things like, if we change the recharge, we change the spring flows, which has an effect on habitat there. We change the habitat available in the braided river. It affects Timana or Ty. It also affects, the value of that gravel extraction industry has changed if we're not extracting gravel to allow the riverbed to build up or whatever. So there's this sort of economics analysis of all those things. And this is kind of where we're at to now with the project. And I guess just to conclude, it's really saying, the scenarios we're using as a tool to explore how you would go about weighing up different options, but they're sort of examples of possible changes rather than a plan for what to do. Drawing lines on maps is really hard. We found this in those scenarios, sort of planning workshops. The values associated with the river and the adjacent land vary from reach to reach and river to river, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It has to be kind of river-specific and reach-specific. But I guess the underlying thing is that our understanding of river systems have evolved, and we now understand much more about the wider impacts of river management. It's not just flood risk you're influencing all these other things. And that means we can evolve how we manage rivers. So instead of having that narrow focus, you can have this more holistic view. But it doesn't have to be a step change. It can be an evolution. So I think I'll leave that there. There's questions to any of us and on Tom's presentation as well.
I'm sure there will be, yes. Just to, for a little bit of context, the project, your MB project, is a 5-year project and you're in year 4, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you're expecting this last year to focus more, as I remember, on this economics values, to be able to say now we understand more of braided rivers, which we didn't so much in New Zealand, but also economic modelling for councils or industry to use. Yeah.
So we're basically at the point where we've got models of each river and we're going to implement these scenarios. So there's ecological considerations and things like that which we need to provide to the economists so that they can do their economics on it. So it's not just about the water balance, but it's also about the gravel balance and the flood protection costs and all that. So that all goes into the economics.
Yeah, great. So great, we've got about half an hour for conversation and questions. So, Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Tom and Joe and Richard and Scott. It's I couldn't make the Forest and Bird presentations on the Making Room for Rivers, so I was very grateful that you could find the time to be with us, Tom. And we are continuing to learn a lot about what we've done wrong over the last 200 years in particular, but importantly what we might do with that knowledge to try and address that. I just wanted a couple of questions for you, Richard, and then if I could just a couple for Tom. The word mediated was not troubling me, but I was just a little bit unclear. When you say the Braid Plain aquifer mediates the exchange of water with the regional aquifer, as you called it. Does that mean like facilitates or enables? Is that the word? Is that the use of the word mediated?
Yeah. I mean, a better word would be partitions, but
Partitions.
yeah, partitions flow. But it's basically passing water between those different water bodies.
So I guess the classic model of kind of rivers interacting with groundwater is you've got the surface water, and then it's leaking out of the river, and then it's in the regional aquifer. But I guess what we're showing is in braided rivers, it's more complicated than that, and there's this intermediate sort of reservoir within the braid plane.
Which actually adds resilience. So it's like what's going on at the surface. There might be a whole lot of variability in how much surface water there is at the time. Flows in the river change all the time. But there's this kind of body of water that's almost like a slow sponge that's gradually leaking. So there's not this direct interaction. It's sort of affected by what's going on in the braid plane aquifer.
And so to an extent, if we, two things that really reduce it to simple terms, if we were able to increase both the width and through, trimming the extraction of gravel, increase the depth, you have a greater mediative capacity of that braid plane.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two levers you can pull. You can pull both of them.
Yeah.
You can pull one or other of them, and it's going to vary from river to river what your best options might be.
Okay. All right, thank you. So wider and higher. Tom, I was very excited about reading these papers and finding the sort of silver bullet. And in particular, the paper about reanimating the strangled rivers of Aotearoa. The words that struck me were locked in. And there's a comment in the paper that there are actually very few places, or it's quite rare for development to be intense within the floodplains of rivers. But I guess Hastings and Napier are those cases, or those rare instances. And I was just most interested and intrigued to find out what we could do, given the enormous challenges we've got funding managed retreat, which we're grappling with at the moment. Until I read the Wellington paper, I was thinking, how on earth is there an answer to that conundrum? It's one thing to make rivers room in less developed communities, but how on earth do you do it in intensively urban development communities? Until I read the bit in the paper about natural disasters provide that opportunity to look for ways to do it. Can you just paint us a bit of a picture of some options we might have in the Napier and Hastings context to follow the Making for Room for Rivers philosophy off the back of Cyclone Gabriel?
Sure. I mean, I can try. I think, as you say, it's kind of a fraught issue, right? We've made this mistake of river management over the past couple of 100 years. It's not anyone's fault in particular. It's the way that we did things in Western science. But you sort of say that, that there's this idea that places are intensely developed, and Napier and Hastings are examples of that. But I think they're maybe not as intensively developed as we might think. So, Lower Hutt, for example, I think is probably one of the most intensively developed floodplains we've got in New Zealand. It's basically the entire floor of that valley is filled with development. Across the Heretatonga Plains, you haven't filled the entire floodplain with development. You've got concentrated areas of it, but there are still large areas of space, mostly, or relatively little developed areas. And I think it's really a matter of looking at the context of the river and the development you've got and looking for the opportunities within whatever constraints you put on yourself. So, for instance, Greater Wellington Regional Council has acknowledged that they're probably not going to pull everyone off that floodplain, at least not overnight. Maybe hundreds of years down the road, that's something we'd consider. But they've gone, what can we do within the narrow space that we have, and how can we combine room for the rivers as a concept with heightening the stop bank? And actually one of the things they're doing in doing that is also looking at how they can reorient Lower Hutt's sort of town centre to face the river so that community sort of acknowledges and recognises again that they live on a floodplain, because at the moment Lower Hutt is very sort of down behind the stop bank and people aren't particularly attached to that river. The opportunity, as you say, with natural disaster is, well, that's not a great way of putting it because the river was just being a river, but with a flood like this is that you can be really strategic about the places that you retreat from, and there's an opportunity there and a momentum to get people out of places of high risk, and to hopefully put that or bundle up benefits as best you can, like the stuff that Joe and Scott and Richard have looked at, and kind of look for those joint opportunities. I mean, I'm not giving much of a great answer, but I think the key thing is that it actually has to really be done at a catchment or river level, and I hate that because that's been used to kick the can down the road for a long time, but you really need to look at the Ngaruroro say, look at where that river used to be through time, look at what's been done in that catchment, look at the LiDAR, look at where it's flooded historically, look at where it flooded during Cyclone Gabriel, and get the community around that river to see that and understand that, and then say, hey, what do we want to do? Do we want to heighten the stop banks, which will protect us to a certain point? It'll cost X amount of money, and there'll be maintenance costs and whatever, and that'll go on ad infinitum until we decide to, no longer line that river with the walls, or we somehow get drought for hundreds of years. Or do we want to do something else? Do we want to back off? Do we want to whatever? And you really have to bring those communities along. And that's your opportunity here, is that you have a community who understands severely the impact of flood events and of the implications of that old school river management. So you kind of have to jump on that. And there's a huge cost thing to that, I get that. But there's a massive cost to natural disaster, and we're much better off having a conversation now about where we want these rivers to go and how they're going to flow when we get another event like this, rather than saying we'll just build the stop banks higher and wait and see what happens. And that's the opportunity.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Jeff.
Councillor Van Beek?
Yeah, good. Hi, Tom. Jared from Bake here. We've met before. Once again, thank you very much for your presentation. It is very, very familiar to me. In item 8, page 6, there is the River Isle mentioned, which is actually the river that I was born next to. I'm a floodplain baby, so I was born on a floodplain. So we, and some of the councillors know where I'm, and I've mentioned this before, but just for those who are in the gallery and you who have presented to us. So my father, who was a farmer, of the floodplain, he would watch the level of the Rhine, if you pronounce it properly, came into Holland, and if it got to a certain height, we would move all animals, all machinery, anything that was deemed not being able to withstand the flood, moved to a farming platform higher up. We were protected by stop banks, by the way, so we were not necessarily outside stop banks. We were actually protected by stop banks, but these stop banks protected us for a certain amount of fresh. But as soon as we got to a certain level coming into the country, we would retreat to the farming platform, and then our farm would be inundated. But the farm was, and the area of farming was really well protected and developed through drainage systems and whatnot. So it took a disaster of Cyclone Gabriel. We got so close to Cyclone Bola when we were evacuated in Twyford. But this disaster, I realised that we actually did have no plan B, and I've talked about that as a councillor around this table. Here in Hawke's Bay, we don't have plan Bs. It's either a stop bank or it's swim as fast as you can and keep floating. And we've seen the result. Together with our chair, who unfortunately can't be here right now. My house also got flooded, yellow stickered. My apple orchard is completely washed away. We're about 800 metres from a major break. But I think what we need to do is actually, in your presentation, you've said give more room to the river, extend that river platform. I think we need to go even further. and I've talked about it with Niall, I believe we as a council should not actually even look at raising stop banks. We actually should be looking at lowering stop banks so that actually we can manage floods like we do in Europe. And I'm pleased that you actually have taken these examples because we can still have productivity where you get occasional floods. My orchards, although where the water force was just too strong, the trees actually been literally washed away. But in areas where we actually been flooded in the rest of Twyford, those trees will survive. They will produce again. So we can actually manage that. And so as we have done in Europe and we've done in other places. So I actually would say you actually need to go further. Just staying within where the rivers were in the time, because the knowledge that we've got with the amount of rain and water that is being now absorbed in the atmosphere, what we know is actually not what we actually know it's going to happen in the future. And Niwa will tell us that story in hopefully years to come. Well, it's not going to be a great story, but it'll be a tough story. But we need to understand there's actually more water coming than we've ever seen before. And so we actually need to start thinking about this going forward. So once again, thank you for a great presentation. You actually put it in pictures that we actually can then relate this to our community, because our community needs to come on board. They haven't got the luxury of us sitting here, listening to it and actually seeing it, and seeing often the amazing pictures that we see through our staff. They don't get to see it. They just get one pager of words and maybe one picture, and that's all they're going to get. We're actually, unfortunately, the enlightened ones. I'm not sure whether that's actually a little bit arrogant, but I shouldn't have said that. But so I think we need to get this out there, which is really important, and to have this discussion. So Plan A didn't work because we didn't have a Plan B, but I don't think Plan B either. It's going to be Plan B, C, D, and E, many of them in future thinking. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, sorry, just jump in, but I think that's a really, it's really heartening to kind of hear that approach of, to me, that speaks to trying to think more about how we actually live with our rivers. And build a culture where we understand how rivers flood, and that when they flood with less energy, and we learn how to cope with those floodwaters. And as you say, Europe, you'll know more than me about this by the sound of it. But as I was reading about the Netherlands, they have floodways which are designed to flood once every 70 years on average, so that it's, within people's lifetime that they're remembering, no, we don't develop there because that area floods. We don't develop there, and that's passed down. That kind of culture around rivers is what we really need. And with Plan Bs, I think that's really great as well. But I just want to caution around, some Plan Bs are different to others. The Manawatu, for example, has a floodplain, the Motua spillway. That's their release valve for the Manawatu River. That works. But there was an instance in the Bay of Plenty with a spillway that when they wanted to open that spillway, they couldn't operate those gates to get it to open, as I understand. So, there's still some of those Plan Bs aren't always going to work, which is why, as you say, you need the Plan C, the Plan D, whatever it is.
Councillor Foley.
Yeah, g'day Tom, it's Will Foley here. Look, thanks for the presentation. You look at the title and you think, oh yeah, it's all going to be about shifting the stop banks as an example, giving the room more width. But what I liked from your presentation was actually that it's a lot more than that, and it's all the stuff we kind of do or already or try to do, and that's things that initially people won't be thinking of, and so you get people that have been flooded and they're like, build the stop banks higher or build stop banks where they aren't there at all. But things like the pests and predators, such as the deer that are wiping out the forest floors, the impact that actually has further downstream, I think, is a really important point to make as an example of the kind of more holistic approach we need to make, because that not only has flood benefits, but a whole host of other benefits as well. And so I think that's probably an important point, particularly around our strategising about how we go forward. And the initial talks we have had so far around this council is that our catchment work actually is just as important as our flood protection work as well. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yes. Yay.
Yeah, that speaks. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that speaks really well to, making room for rivers is a thing that was grabbed internationally from the Netherlands and sort of picked up as this concept. But there's all this, nature-based solutions is what we're starting to use in New Zealand as an idea to capture more than that, wetlands and forests and things. But there's natural floodplain management and slow water, and all of that is sort of acknowledging that you don't just have to come in at the bottom of the catchment and deal with the river when it's near the community. You can deal with water wherever it is in the catchment, and slowing it down and holding it upstream is one option, and that's looked at a lot overseas as well. So yeah, worth keeping in mind.
Could I just come to these guys?
Yes, sure.
Don't want to give them all to Tom. Just on some really fascinating work you guys are doing over here, and particularly around the gravels. So, here in Hiratonga and down in CHB, gravels big issue. Just generalising, we've been told we're sort of over-extracted here, and not so much down in Central Hawke's Bay. So it's going to be really interesting to see, the kind of outcomes of your work, and trying to find that balance between aquifer recharge versus flood protection, because as much as stop banks, there's been a huge focus gone to gravel and the amount of gravel in our rivers and what that does to flood protection. And so, I'm not saying it's going to be easy to come to a conclusion that gives us that good compromise, if you like.
I would say just on that topic, you're not the only council grappling with this. There's those problems we see of over extraction close to demand locations, close to cities, and no demand in areas with problems of aggradation further away from cities. That's all over New Zealand. West Coast has huge problems with aggradation on a lot of its rivers because there's no demand. Canterbury has over extraction near Christchurch, and areas of build up further inland at the head of the plains. So it's those same problems of how to drive extraction, where it's needed and not just where it's cheap for the extractors and they can make money is a global issue.
I guess just to finish, it's trying to work out what's the desired level. What is over and under extraction with regards to those two issues, flood protection and aquifer recharge. So, that's where I think your work will be pretty important. Thanks.
Just before, quickly, I unfortunately need to go, but once again, I want to also give you guys credit as well, as the people know in the gallery, that actually possibly water in the aquifer is even more important than flooding. It's funny, but in my previous, but it's really heartening to hear that actually there will be some solutions for the Hiratonga Plains, and that I always could never figure out why the artificial recharge at Fernal actually never worked, or it did work, and we found out it worked, but the regional council or the predecessor of the regional council thought, no, it didn't work, get rid of it. We would have had an enormous amount of data if that had worked, and with the technology that we've got now, we would have known a lot, learned more about that. So that actually making that bed more transferable into the aquifer would have been a really good amount of data to have and knowledge to have, so that these discussions would be a lot easier. But anyway, thank you very much for your work. Unfortunately, I need to go.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McIntosh.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Tom. That was the second time for me too, but equally compelling second time round. So if I sort of really simplify it, I reckon we could say to these guys and Ian's team, okay, you got 12 months, guys, come up with a solution. And they would. Because at a micro level, we attended a session at Waimarama a few weeks back about wetland restoration there, for example. And so, if we are going to make a really good job at this, actually, all the answers exist within the collective expertise of what we've got. So to some extent, we've got no excuse but to make a great job of it, because the answers are there. whether we make a great job or not, I reckon actually is down to our ability to bring the people along with us. So, if we, as you have said, if we sit down in a room with you all, actually, how can you argue against that? But we are in the privileged position of getting that detail of information, so we can reach those conclusions. So, really, what I'm saying is, all the stuff we've been through, and we attended that historical session on the history of flooding in Hawke's Bay a while ago too.
Michael Fowler.
Been about 4 of them of this scale. On each occasion they said, this is the worst there's ever been. It wasn't. Can't let it happen again, kind of. And then a couple of years after that they said, we got it sorted. Well, they didn't. And the most recent of those, I think, was when they opened the Chestnut Bridge in the 60s. So we need to at least learn from that to the extent of knowing that we can't give blanket guarantees of all sorts of stuff as they attempted to do there, because on each of those 4 prior occasions they were wrong. The appropriate solution, which is not saying to people we're never going to have a flood like this again, we've protected you and so on and so forth, is one that we have the tools and the know-how to do. But really, to get back to the earlier point and in summary, I reckon the extent to which we're able to do that and successful in doing that actually is down to the extent to which we can bring people along with us.
Mr. Curtin?
Well, thanks, Chair. A very fascinating presentation. Much appreciated, Tom and the team. And I liked the reference and signalling to our policy positions, particularly the regional policy statement, etc., changing those settings and taking a leaf out of the Wellington Regional Council's shift to away from structural protection work. My question is a segue to that, and I just wondered whether there was a view around our approach to coastal hazards as well, where currently our setting is to stop the sea. We want to stop it from getting anywhere near us, build some structures. As a general principle, in light of climate change, etc., where should we be heading and what policy shifts should we be making, not only on our terrestrial environment but our coastal environment? Any views on that?
I'll jump in first on this, but anyone else is welcome to. Interestingly, the coastal conversation is one that most councils and communities are having, and sort of not necessarily recognising that they need to have a similar conversation about rivers. So you're almost in a unique position when compared to other councils that you have had a massive reminder that you need to be thinking about rivers as well. The limitation of that conversation, as you say, is that in many places the conversation is we'll just build a seawall. And you've seen that with Napier City Council out by Perfume Point there, building, as I understand it, I could be wrong, you can correct me, but building a seawall to protect a small number of houses that probably never should have been put there in the first place, in my view. But so that tends to be the conversation, but there are councils that are shifting around that, right? So as I understand it, Western Bay of Plenty District Council has taken an approach in some of their coastal planning documents to, and I say planning, I mean sort of policy and strategy planning, to acknowledge to the community that they're not going to just keep fighting the ocean. They're moving past just building walls. Similarly with South Dunedin, so Dunedin City Council, with South Dunedin being basically a natural bathtub, not dissimilar to the Napier problem, they are working on a multi-year strategy for how they retreat from parts of South Dunedin. I think you probably have an opportunity here to try and talk to your community about flood issues from all perspectives in Hawke's Bay, coastal included, not just rivers, and yeah, it's going to be that same thing. You fight and fight and fight the sea. You essentially push the problem away. You kick it down the road, and at some point that's going to get the better of you. And yeah, I don't know what the solution is there, but I think you need to be taking a really long-term view on how you look at coastal retreat and things like that, because it tends to be a small number of people at massive expense that are being protected or benefited by that. And it doesn't allow for things like retreat of those ecosystems from, further inland, which needs to be thought about as well.
Just a couple of thoughts on this topic. I think, as Tom said, in some ways the discussion around coastal retreats is further ahead than the river conversation, but I think this idea of adaptive pathways, which is emerging for coastal management, I think we can learn a lot from that in terms of, there's obviously going to be some decisions you make in the short term about recovery from the cyclone and short-term changes to the river system, but then there's maybe these adaptation triggers like you have on the coast. We're gonna build a wall, but once the sea level gets to this level, or once that wall starts to fail, the next thing that's going to happen is this, and we don't know if that's going to be in 10 years or 30 years, or those similar ideas could be used in river management. So, this is the current line of the stock bank, but if or when we get that next big flood that causes failure in this area, we've got in our planning that we want to reduce development in this area, and maybe we've got this sort of longer term trajectory in mind. So that kind of adaptive pathway is something that's been developed for the coastal setting but is really relevant to rivers. And then the other thought I had quickly was just around some of the central government work on Managed Retreat and the Managed Retreat Act, which I think is coming up in the next few years maybe. And I guess the focus of that has always been coastal driven, perhaps, but it's really important that is broad enough to be able to encompass these kind of river issues as well.
Just a couple of questions from me. I just didn't know if the councillors were aware that this Strangled Rivers paper, that Joe and Richard are co-authors on that. So at lunch, if you have specific questions on it. I'm quite interested in the paper and the expertise and understanding of rivers. Do you think we have in New Zealand the expertise and knowledge that they now have through practice in Europe to be designing and looking at these, what could, as you say, be 10, 20, 100-year changes to the environment? Do you think we have that knowledge in New Zealand to be looking at that now?
Yeah, I think so. You go.
I think that the technical knowledge is all there. The challenge is, as has been raised here, is almost the social science and the economics aspect of how you make those decisions and bring the communities along and resolve the competing values, rather than the nitty-gritty, like real,
I think one of the issues we have is we quite often work in silos. So us scientists are quite good at talking to other scientists, and we know our stuff and we communicate it to other scientists. But trying to actually communicate that and implement that is kind of a further step that we're still getting better and better at doing that. So I think that paper, it basically got driven out of a lot of us kind of river geomorphologists who understand how rivers adjust over time and kind of what they're doing. We all collectively kind of had that understanding that we were like, we need to be unified as one voice to say, look, this is what we're seeing across the country, this is what we're seeing globally, to kind of try and get that message out there. And we wrote a paper for The Conversation, which is kind of more popular science, as well as the Strangled Rivers and the Wise Water paper. They're both kind of the same group of people, essentially, trying to get that word out there more publicly and trying to give talks like this to try and communicate that and bring the public along. Because that's the hard part. Change is hard. Yeah.
This research program is one small example of trying to break down those silos, in that, Joe and I have never worked with a groundwater scientist before, and actually joining those two disciplines in this project has been really hard because we have different terminologies for everything and different knowledge. And but it's also it's the hardest bit of the project, but it's also been the best outcomes from the project to come from that cross-disciplinary.
Yes, yeah. I have a strange question because I read a paper last week on avulsion and how it's something we can plan for in our river management and river planning. And it seemed like it was a relatively new, I know it's not a new idea, but a new way of looking at our rivers. Is that something you're incorporating? And maybe explain what it is, if anyone, or maybe you all know.
I'm not sure the context of what you've been reading, but an avulsion is basically you have a channel that's heading in one direction and then it can avulse and shift direction, essentially. So braided rivers, they're like multiple channels, multiple braids, they avulse all the time. That's actually part of their natural kind of behaviour to shift within a braid plane. But potentially what you've been reading about might have been like a single thread meandering river that may have avulsed and shifted its alignment. So typically meandering rivers might be gradually adjusting across a braid plane, across the floodplain, but occasionally they might actually like break out and take a new path.
Yeah, and the paper was saying that can be well planned for because you can actually understand what it's going to do and should be included in this sort of...
You may be able to predict where it's likely to avulse to based on surface sort of topography, like ground elevations. There's generally water wants to flow downhill, right?
And a lot of avulsions are into locations where the river has previously been.
Yeah,
so when you look at those LiDAR pictures, you can see the old channels across the plains. And looking at that, you get an idea of which are the locations where it's most vulnerable to, not just braid switching course within the braid plane, but the whole braid plane switching location.
So that's all.
And the same with meandering rivers, same deal.
And my last question is around gravel, because of the importance of gravel to our economy. So I'm interested, two things. One, that all the economic modelling is going to take that into account, that part of it, but to a really basic question, so I understand, when we talk about the gravel layer and then this next layer, if the river naturally is wider and it's running in its braided plane, does the gravel manage itself far better, so that what I'm saying is the build-up of gravels and the peaks and troughs, are they far more manageable within the braided plane? Is part of the problem of the narrowing that we're creating artificial situations with the gravel, or will a braided river always grow and will the gravel naturally do that anyway?
So I guess whether the gravel is building up or eroding or just flowing through on this big conveyor belt is quite reach specific. It depends on what's going with the river slope and with sort of geological controls due to historic earthquakes and tectonics and things. So it can be quite reach specific. But in terms of those real problems you're getting, where you're getting gravel build up, increasing flood risk, for example, in the upper parts of the Tukituki, by leaving the river more room, that same volume of gravel spreads out over a bigger area, so you get less height change for the same volume of gravel. So your problems happen a lot more slowly, and the river can spread that impact over a much, rather than just filling up between the stop banks. It fills up a wider area to a lesser extent.
Makes sense, yeah. Mr. Eden.
So just got one question. It's just around the biodiversity of the area, and you mentioned about Indigenous and poplar and potentially changing the planting regime in relation to natives on the whether it's along the riverbeds, and then obviously I think there was mention about the inanga, because obviously we noticed the decline in that, and then when you're talking about a management plan, how do we increase the biodiversity in that river when I suppose culturally we've seen a reduction in inanga in the Tutakiri awa, and then in that planning stages would going to more natives and sort of backwashes, I suppose, where it doesn't appear that, you just be able to go down to a pit watercress. You can't do that now, where you've got to say duckweed that is growing. So I suppose in any planning document, would that accommodate the biodiversity and that design mechanism within the river system?
So, Joe, I don't know. Yeah, I can jump in, and Joe, you might have something to add. So, I mean, the simple answer is yes, basically. The more you can let the river be a river, the more you're going to get that natural development of diversity of habitat types developing. So those riffles, which, torrent fish like, the pools, the runs, those backwaters, the sort of areas that are wet but aren't necessarily flowing, that's all really important habitat for fish and macroinvertebrates, which, fish feed on, and birds and all that sort of stuff. We're talking here at like a really big river scale in most of what we've been talking about, but that habitat stuff actually occurs on like a reach scale, like, a couple of 100 meters or even less. And we tend to forget that habitat diversity stuff. So when the gravel extractors, for instance, get into the Ngāruroro River around Maraekakaho, I think it is, that gravel extraction you can see in the maps has pushed the river to one side of the wetted area of the river to one side of the channel, and it's just this big one long straight section. So you can step back and look at the river and go, oh yeah, it's big and wide and it's got a big gravel area. But that habitat all through that section is just one big long straight run. And that habitat, diversity that should be there isn't there anymore. So the more we can back off the river, the more those areas can sort of come back and be naturally developed again. You can get into streams like those streams in Auckland that have been concreted and kind of put rocks back and logs back and create that habitat again. But simple answer being, yeah, if we can let them more naturally adjust, we're going to get that habitat coming back. And the more we can step back and give, rivers like the Ngāruroro, for example, more room, you're just vastly increasing the area of habitat. That Rangitata example I gave, for example, you cut off the whole south branch, that's, hectares and hectares of habitat that's just gone. And that's one of the key stresses for our native fish. There is a DOC report coming out shortly that your staff should definitely keep an eye out for, which is going to be a 10 key native fish species and the habitat requirements for each of those. So it's evidence-based. What are the things that are important to inanga, to tuna, to torrent fish? I can't remember all 10 species that they've done, but it's basically almost like you can create a table and tick a box going, yeah, riffles are important for this species. We need to be really careful about what we do with our riffle habitat because we've got them in our river, that kind of thing. And that will be really useful, hopefully, for you in doing some of that. Joe, did you have anything to add?
Well, I'd add a kind of a braided river specific lens because I love talking about braided rivers. If I go back to a picture of what the Ngāruroro looked like in 1964. Yep, there it is. That one there. It's not super clear on this picture, but naturally braided rivers are real hotspots of biodiversity. And one of the reasons that they're a real hotspot for biodiversity is they adjust over these really wide areas, and it might be that only like part of that area is active, like kind of bare gravel and water at any particular period of time, and then there'll be other areas within that braid plain that maybe haven't been mobilised or wet for maybe like 5 or 10 years, and then there might be other areas that haven't been mobilised for 20, 50 years, and you end up with this real diversity of different surfaces that have a different succession of vegetation, and that vegetation supports invertebrates, and there's this real kind of diversity of habitats that supports biodiversity. But with the narrowing that we've done of our rivers, we've basically turned the river from this really kind of diverse system into kind of sort of bipolar, essentially. It's like bare gravel and water or willows and not much in between. And in doing that, we've really we've really impacted the biodiversity. So I guess that's one of the ecological gains of giving the river a bit more room and letting it kind of adjust. You give it an opportunity to have a diversity of surfaces and support biodiversity. So I guess that's my pitch for ecology.
I guess the only note of caution in that is that the other driver of narrowing over that time frame has been weeds and exotic species.
Yeah.
And if we make our rivers wider, then there is this weed management issue that we have to deal with. That we deal with the current system, but that's, I guess, the...
Yeah, absolutely. The systems we've got now are a bit different to what they used to be like now that we've got a lot more weeds in the system.
So if we give the river room and don't do any management of weeds, it won't look like this, unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah. So last question, Councillor Williams, because these guys will be staying for lunch.
I was just going to move that we receive the presentations, if you like, but thank all of our contributing speakers, not only for taking the time to be with us today, but for the work and initiative you're showing as thought leaders for the nation in this really, really important context in a climate change and biodiversity challenged world. So, yeah, thank you for being here, and I do encourage Forest and Bird or any of you to submit to our independent review, which will be looking at how our flood protection schemes performed and really how we should look at approaching this whole issue for the future to protect our communities and the systems themselves. So thank you very much.
Nicely said. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you.
Happy to second. Thank you. Just to receive the report, all those in favour, please say aye. Any against? Carried. Thank you. Brings us to the end of our formal meeting. We've got lunch, which I hope you'll stay for, so we'll be able to have conversation over lunch. Before I close the meeting, Mr. Eden, would you be happy to close with a karakia for us?
Close the meeting or bless the food?
Close the meeting and bless the food. Both would be lovely. Yeah.
Hey, karakia koutou, kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te ao tātou reki ai, kai tēnei te aroa o te atua me te tahitanga ki te ware tapu ake amen. I'll do a karakia for that. Kai. No mai e nā au o papatunui o ranganui ki te kai whatiki ki ora. Haumi ui e tai ki.
Kia ora, thank you. So, meeting closed, and we're going to be back here about 25 to 2 for our workshop.